for having me. My name is Katie, and I work with the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia. As you've probably heard, there are numerous changes coming to ICBC, most of which are effective April 1st of 2019. Many of these changes are positive to you as practitioners and to you as kinesiologists. Some of those positive changes are the new fee structure that will be in place for April 1st of next year, as well as new and more streamlined processes for reporting and invoicing. Some of the changes to reporting will be a new template form that kinesiologists are required to complete if they're working with an ICBC customer. And the form itself is highly focused on functional abilities and will require a full functional assessment of an ICBC customer. And the intent behind this is to have objective measures by which the practitioner can monitor progress and recovery, and also to have a baseline by which to measure the progress of the customer throughout their rehabilitation. So seminars such as these are fantastic tools and resources to make sure that you have the skills to be able to complete the functional requirements of the report, and also to make sure that you are prepared for April 1st to make the transition as smooth as possible. We will have more information on the report itself, so the actual content of that, early in the new year, as well as additional resources and support to make sure that you have those skills and are ready to go to treat our customers in April. So thanks again for having me, and again, we'll loop back early in the new year for some more information. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello everyone, I'm Anna Christina Arnold, and it's a real pleasure to be asked by BCAK to give this webinar today, and I also want to thank ICBC for supporting the webinar and for recognizing how important kinesiologists are in the whole process of returning back to function for both daily activity tasks and in the workplace as well. So today's webinar objectives are for you to appreciate and understand how important understanding the tasks that people will be doing in their daily living and also potentially in their work are to informing functional ability testing and matching abilities to tasks in the workplace. What I want to be able to do by the end of the seminar is to introduce you to some resources that you might be able to access to understand tasks a little bit better. Some of you may be using some of these already. Many of you may be doing your own job demands analyses, but I will go through that quickly and talk about that. But I'll also really focus on some more ergonomic specific methodologies that can be used or accessed to understand tasks in the workplace and in daily living. So clearly, I think we all recognize as people who are involved in the return to work process how important it really is to get people through that rehabilitation phase, make sure we do really good functional assessments, understand where people are so that we can get people back to their lives quickly. And there's so much literature that supports the need to do that in an efficient manner. So we know that for workers in general, the longer you leave it, then the less likely they're going to return back to work. So we have a statistic here where that when people are away from work for more than 6 months after injury, the likelihood of returning to work ever can drop to as low as about 25%. So very, very poor outcomes in terms of actually getting people back to work and function. In addition, we see that even if we do get people back to work, that those positions are often unsuited to them. So maybe from a modified work situation that doesn't quite fit very well, or maybe it's not even physiologically or biomechanically fit, but it could be a poor psychological fit, so they don't feel comfortable with the supervisor or the culture in the environment and so on. And so understanding all those aspects are really critical in terms of success in this area. The other thing that becomes really apparent too, and we know Leishon and Shaw out of London, I believe, and our Sherbrooke models and so on out of Quebec, that really activity at home and at work is treatment in itself. And the sooner we can get people back into those environments where they can use their daily tasks or their work tasks, they are going to heal more quickly. And the better we can match those, we can get people back to function. So really that's what we're trying to do. But it's not simple, and we know this. It's a really complex problem. So I've got two different models here. So the ecological case management model is really just showing that when we're trying to get people back to function, there's so many different things that we need to consider. So we need to consider physical aspects of the client, of course, their ability, but we might also want to understand their social status, their understanding of what the return to function process is. We also need to understand the healthcare system, sort of what's in place, the roles of physicians, the roles of kinesiologists. We need to understand the insurance system. We also need to understand societal factors as well. So all of these play into the success of getting people back to a healthy state again. Of course, some of you, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the biosocial model of pain, and that we really have to recognize that pain is not just physiological, that there's so many other aspects that we need to consider, so people's attitudes and beliefs, all the way up to illness behavior and sort of our social structures that influence pain and perception of pain. So in that context, we need to consider what we're doing here as well. One of the models that's really useful for understanding tasks comes from OT, from occupational therapy. And this is from the World Health Organization, the International Classification of Functioning. And so in doing functional assessments at a very, very detailed level, the ICF is a very useful tool, because what it really does is it focuses on barriers and facilitators for function. And instead of looking at sort of global specific tasks, it really looks at what people can do and can't do. And it allows for then modifying the work to fit people's capabilities, which is a big part of what you'll be doing or need to understand. And it also focuses on both the micro and the macro parts of ergonomics, so understanding sort of the task that people do, the physical environment, and also the biosocial social environment as well. So I really do like Leishon and Shaw's work here, that they looked at the ICF. But we can't do this without really understanding what people do and what we're asking people to do around the tasks. I put this graphic together, and I'm really excited about the changes that ICBC is making and putting the emphasis and understanding on what kinesiologists know and what kinesiologists can do. We've always been a member of the CARE team, but now I think that we are really the hub of the communication between healthcare practitioners. And by having understanding of physiology, anatomy, activity, ability, and also having a really good understanding of the workplace and function and tasks that people do, we can communicate with all the various stakeholders. So looking back at communicating with the insurance provider, for example, and the case manager in terms of exactly what the tasks are and how they might be modified. or communicating back to the workplace and the return to work team there. Out in the community, if someone is not working but returning back to daily activity tasks, talking to the social worker or the home care workers in terms of a task related and how that could be modified. Those are all really important things. And of course, your ergonomist can help there in terms of understanding tasks. So that really brings us to what my role here today is. And of course, I'm just a small piece of the process, and your next webinar coming up is going to be focused more on the defining the abilities and assessing abilities. Today I'm really looking at task work assessment and how they can inform an active rehab program, and helping you understand how to understand tasks better. So right now, if we're looking at generally assessing abilities, we can look at assessing abilities through a Bulbar test, for example, and compare that to norms and see where people are. But that doesn't really tell us much about how that's going to apply to the tasks that people need to do. This comes from the National Occupational Classification System, and of course the NOC provides classifications in broad categories for things like body position, dexterity, strength, tolerance, limits, and so on. And these are really useful in terms of identifying progress that people are having in terms of their rehab. But I'd argue that they're a little broad, a little challenging to really understand exactly what's done in the workplace or done at home in the community. So yeah, they're standardized approaches, they're systematic, but they're not really any gold standards to really understand how to best match the task to the abilities. And those that are done well are by really experienced rehab professionals that have seen people coming through over and over and over again. So I think what is really useful is for kinesiologists to have a better understanding of task assessment so that this can be done more quickly without having to wait for 25 years of experience of seeing people come through. So I'm going to start by talking about this idea of how we start to look at tasks about what people do, whether it's in the work environment or whether it's in their own home. And we can think of work as either described, prescribed, or analyzed. And I've sort of adapted this from another model. But I think often what we come across is trying to, in a clinical setting, so we may have a client who's recovering from an injury, and we say, okay, well, tell me what your work is about. Oh, I'm a plumber. Okay. Work as described is going to be very much influenced by my past experience with understanding what a plumber is. You tell me what a plumber is, I all of a sudden have a vision of what that looks like. That may be correct. It probably is missing a lot of pieces. There's a lot of holes in that. So when people describe their work, it doesn't give you a really big, clear picture necessarily of what the activities are that you need to be paying attention to for rehab. So, our exposure to the work is going to influence how we interpret that. We have our own biases. Maybe we have previous clients that have been plumbers, and they tell us they do a certain thing, but the client that you have right now does something very different, right? So we also have client biases. And what are they telling you about their tasks? What aren't they telling you? What influences what they tell you? Perhaps they're a little bit worried about, the process of them being able to get back to their function. They may not tell you exactly some of the tasks that they need to do and so on. So we really need to think about that. It's really an inadequate synthesis there. The mental models leave things out. So what about work as prescribed? Well, what I mean here is that there are lots of documents of what people do in the workplace. So I'd call that work as prescribed. So there are laws, there are regulations. You can go and look those up for different kinds of tasks. So we look at a plumber and we say, okay, yep, this is what they're expected to do. Standard operating procedures. So Those are things that you can look at. It's going to give you an idea of what the task is. There's checklists out there and lots of other tools. Every job legally has to have a job description, so that's always a really good place to start. But the job description is how the work is prescribed. It's not necessarily how the work is actually done. And I think we can all experience this, is that if you talk to your colleague, they may do a task very differently from what you do yourself. So that can be a problem. Job analysis, the terminology job analysis. So sometimes you can access these as well. So these are developed for bona fide occupational requirements, so for legislation and so on, and are used in hiring practices and training practices as well. So that would be an example of prescribed work. So, you know, they are useful, but they're not a comprehensive picture. So generally, the prescriptions are made by people who are quite far away from the work. So it may be made by a supervisor, or it might even be made by an industrial engineer who's never done the job before. So that can be really problems. They assume to be the right way to do it, and they aren't sometimes not the right way. They also don't identify how modifications can be done to the job. So it's really impossible. So the point is that often those are the two ways that we look at tasks in a clinical environment. We don't have a lot of time. We're going to listen to what people say. We're going to make some assumptions. You might look at a job description. But it's really not giving us a big enough picture. So we really need to broaden our thinking and think a little bit more about different kinds of task and work analysis. So this slide really just shows that there's lots of people involved. There's lots of different ways that people analyze tasks for different kinds of reasons. But today what I'm really going to focus on are ways to analyze tasks that would be suitable for you as a kinesiologist in this kind of situation. So we're going to look at physical and job demands analysis. We'll look a little bit at some different task analysis techniques from ergonomics, talk a bit about simulations, and then I'm going to go through some assessment tools for you that may well be useful in your practice. So just a bit of terminology. So physical demands analysis is really a systematic evaluation of the physical tasks that someone is going to do in the workplace, whereas we use the term job demands analysis to also include cognitive and behavioral aspects of the task. So often kinesiologists are asked to do PDAs, and the OTs are brought in for the behavioral and cognitive aspects of it. So if you're looking for a resource, I would suggest that you look for the job demands analysis, so the bigger picture, because those cognitive and behavioral aspects may really inform some of the things that you might want to be doing with your client. Task analysis is an ergonomic tool that we're going to, I'm going to show you some examples of today. So we're really looking at trying to find sort of systematic evaluations that are objective, that are reliable, and that are going to really give us some good understanding of, you know, the variety of kinds of things that people do out there in the workplace. Okay, this slide here really talks about the difference between what an ergonomist might do from a systems perspective in terms of prevention, whereas a sort of shorter rehabilitation process might look quite not as in-depth. But all tools may be useful for your purposes. So I'm going to start with a job demands analysis. So a JDA, or a job demands analysis, is really specifically designed for the return to work process or the return to function process, and really looking at the characteristics in the workplace that need to be examined. So they are based, typically performed by OTs or KINs or sometimes ergos as well. And there's really key questions around the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of various kinds of tasks. And generally take about an hour for a simple job. If it's a more complex job, it could be, so there's a lot of variety in it, it could take, you know, a few days to actually complete JDA. The important thing to remember is that it serves as a reference document for a lot of different people. So for the kin, but also for the physician, also for the OT, for the PT, for perhaps an ergo that's involved in as well, and the functional assessment providers. So this is this is an example of a JDA that was actually done here in BC on a farming community. And so essentially it gives a narrative summary at the beginning that gives you an overview of what the tasks are. We would call this a prose task description, so it gives you the big picture. Typically the next section looks at identifying what the strength demands are, the mobility demands are, and then the sensory demands are in broad strokes. And then you're going to get a table whereby the ranges of the strength demands and the intensity of the strength demands are outlined along with comments. So you're getting a lot more detail here that you're using the National Occupational Classification Standards for identifying whether occasional efforts are happening, whether they're frequent, what the intensity levels are, and also comparing typical versus exceptional situations. So the strength ratings go from limited to heavy, and so an example of limited would be about 0 to 5 kilograms would be considered a limited strength, and a heavy strength would be greater than 20 kilograms. So if we're talking about discompressive forces and biomechanical load, when you're getting up to 20 kilograms, you're really getting up to very maximal loads. Those are very, very heavy loads in terms of the strength demands there. So these PDA forms are generally standardized, and so there is a source for physical demands analysis through the IAPA. So this is a form that you can access for free, and it is standardized. It provides all of the elements within the form. So I'd recommend that you have a look at this if you're not familiar with them, and that it may be a resource that you can actually use in your practice. Okay.
Want to minimize it?
Okay. We'll get there.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. All right. So, yeah, there is a resource there that you can look at, and they provide a lot of information in looking at those particular categories and those broad categories. We also find that it has a lot of documentation around broad strokes, return to function, return to activity. Also in terms of the behavior and cognitive demands, they can be rated as well. So you can have a look at that on that form. So before I talk about some of the downsides of the JDA, I'll just talk a little bit about some tools that you can use for gathering data for a job demands analysis. So much like I said is, reviewing of documentation that's out there. So the prescribed kind of job described resources that are there, so descriptions. But also the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which is getting a little bit outdated. And the ONET, those are American resources that are really useful for describing jobs. But our National Occupational Classification, the Clinical Handbook, is particularly useful. So I just wanted to show you what this might look like. So I've actually pulled up here the National Occupational Classification subgroup and given you an example here for, this is marine plumbers. So essentially what you can do is you can type in the occupation and it'll bring you to, if you're looking up in the career handbook, it'll bring you to a site where the various functions have been rated for strength, ability, motor coordination, manual dexterity. You can see all the various categories here. But they're actually graded in different categories. So it'll also provide lots of other information on here in terms of data, people, things. So how much interaction with data, how much interaction with people, how much interaction with manipulation and sort of physical characteristics around things. So this is a really good resource. There's a lot of information here about the task. And if you can get a real definitive description of the job from your client, then you may be able to go into the National Occupational Classification and get a lot of information about it. So I would encourage becoming familiar with that. So other resources, well, there's lots of previous engineering or ergonomic or return to work reports out there. So online, in the literature, with some of your peers. Those can be really good resources for understanding tasks as well. But the main resource is really a video or a site visit to be able to actually see the job, and bringing along some instrumentation in terms of weight scales, tape measures, push-pull gauges to be able to assess some of the loads and so on that people are performing. So one of the critical things that'll be useful for you as kinesiologists in terms of assessment protocols and rehab, active rehab, is identifying essential versus non-essential jobs. So why does this become important? Well, non-essential jobs are jobs that you can, people don't need to do when they actually get back to function. And so that you can actually return people back to work quicker because they're not essential. They don't need to perform those tasks. And so if you can be really clear about what those are, you can speed up the recovery process by using the work environment as a treatment protocol to get them to be doing the essential tasks. So what we really want to do is really understand the essential, or what we in ergonomics call the critical task, so that we can really determine what those elements are in that essential part of the task. So I would say a JDA, to start with, does a really good overview of what the job is. So if you can get hold of one, fantastic, right? If you can do them yourself, that's great, that's ideal, and but sometimes you don't have the time, or that's not your role to do the JDA. I did also want to show you a couple of other resources here for actually finding JDAs. And so if you look at these two tabs over here, so this first one is excellent resource if you are looking for JDAs in the whole municipal area. So people that work for cities. So here you're going to get maintenance workers. You're also going to get librarians, and so a range of JDAs have been posted here. And you can't see the whole website, but you can see arena service worker, city coroner. So these have actually been done already, and you can pull those up for your client. Right? You can match and see what sort of tasks are being done. The other example that I have up here is actually more for the forest industry, and our forest industry, so here this is Alberta forest industry, has actually done a similar kind of thing, and what I like here is that they actually provide videos with the task as well. So what you can do is you can sit down with your client and say, oh, you're a trimmer, right? You're a trimmer in a lumber mill. This is what I understand your task to be. Is this actually what you do? And typically they'll say, oh, no, we don't do it that way here. Right? So it's a really good start. Okay, so do have a look at those resources. There are others around as well, but so there are these JDAs online that you can access. But what are some of the challenges? So the categories tend to be really broad. Often there aren't really clear indicators for job modification, so it's not really clear about how you can actually tweak the tasks that people are going to do. teaching people how to do a task a little bit differently to support their injury or actually help the rehab of their injury. They aren't always available either, so that can be a challenge. So what are some other things that can be done? Well, a task description, as I say. So a task description or a task analysis, by definition, a description is literally just a description, and analysis analyzes the task, but of course they're used synonymously. But it really is a more in-depth look at exactly what the task is at a very detailed level. So this typically is used to assess risk factors and to make modifications, but if you can get hold of a task analysis that's been completed, you're going to get a much better understanding of the job. So as I say, they're typically done on critical tasks, and critical tasks are the essential tasks in a JDA. They're either done, by definition more than 50% of the time, or it's something really critical that needs to happen. That maybe a lot of errors are being made on it, or maybe it's a challenging task that you need to analyze in some way. So there's a number of different techniques. I'm really going to focus on the hierarchical task description today, but I've just quickly given you some slides, a slide here on prose. And so prose is literally the first page of a JDA, which is a written description of what the job is all about. So you would start from the beginning of what someone does in the task and write it out all the way to the end. Why is this useful? I actually find this really helpful because I can pass it back to a client and they can read through it and say, yep, that works, that fits, and that doesn't. But as I say, I want to focus on the hierarchical task analysis. So an HTA, or hierarchical task analysis, is exactly as it sounds. It's a hierarchical analysis of the various things that people do. And so what we do is we have different tasks within an organization, or it could be out in daily living. And you break it down then into the various jobs that they might do. You take that one job and break it down into the various tasks that that individual might do. And then within that task, you break it down to what we call the activity level. And what we mean by the activity level is where you can start to measure a discrete element. So every task is going to involve a number of different movements. Here's when we can actually start to analyze at that discrete activity level. So here's an example of a welder HTA, and we use a very specific numbering system. I've just taken a very small piece out of this HTA here. So 5.0 would be at the task level, and 5.1 would be at the activity level in this case. So you're really looking at those little elements. So now why could this be useful? Well, you can see, okay, uncoiling the hose. How frequently is that done? Right? Is there another way that we could get that hose uncoiled? Could we use some kind of mechanical assist there? Is it some other solution, right? Or is there a way that I can train my client through rehab to uncoil it in a different way, right? So rather than having flexion of the shoulder and abduction of the shoulder, how can I limit that and bring it down into a neutral posture? So that's where it can be helpful there. What we also do is identify each activity with a motor, cognitive, and a perceptual rating. So MCP stands for motor, cognitive, perceptual. So motor is physical, cognitive is understanding, decision making, and perceptual is where you're using your five senses. So why might this be important? Why would I need to identify whether something is motor, cognitive, or perceptual? Well, perhaps there's a perceptual element, like I need to see something, that forces me into an awkward position. Maybe there's an auditory signal that I need to hear, but my injury has influenced my hearing temporarily. How then am I going to work with that with my client? Right? So from that perspective, these can be really useful. This one you can see is for a cashier, which many of you can relate to. And you can see at the activity level now we have 2.1.2, for example, so we've broken it down to another level. And each box has a different M, C, or P. We've identified how long that takes, what the issues are, and made some notes as to whether there's errors there or not. So you can see this is very tedious. You wouldn't want to be doing this for every task, but it may well be that an ergonomist done this for you already for the task that your client might be doing. So what other assessment tools do ergonomists use to understand tasks in general? Well, there's all kinds out there. I've chosen a few for you today. All of these tools have been epidemiologically linked to risk factors, so they have varying degrees of validity and reliability, but they're all generally quite good. And frankly, typically, we need to employ a number of different methodologies to really start to understand the task. And so we can have observational, biomechanical, physiological, psychophysiological, and some combined assessment tools. I actually borrowed this matrix from the IAPA as well. So they have actually given us this flow chart that you can have a closer look at later, but it talks about different kinds of assessment tools for different kinds of conditions. So here it says you want to observe the job, break the job into tasks for manual handling tasks. If it's a pushing and pulling, you might want to look at the Liberty Snook tables, in other words, the Liberty Mutual tables. If it is a non-materials handling task, it's a repetitive action here, you might want to look at the ACGIH hand-arm limit. So it gives you some guidance as to what to look for, so you can look at that. Some observation assessment tools that you should be familiar with. There's something called OWASP. We love acronyms in ergonomics, so OWASP, REBA, and RULA. And all of these techniques are really quite simple to do. You use video of the task, or you can simulate the task in the rehab center. And you can then quantify the risk for that task, either as people are going through their recovery program. So you may see how they move for a particular kind of task before, and then as you're progressing through the rehab program, how they might move after. So you could use it that way. Typically, ergonomists use this as before and after interventions to see whether we've actually improved things. So of course you could use that way as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these just because of the time that we have today, but I'll basically introduce them to you so you have a sense, and then you might be able to access them, or you will be able to access them if you have some time. So probably the one that's least familiar with in North America is OWASP, and it's actually the one that's been around for a long time. It comes out of Finland, and it was the sort of beginning of RULA and REBA, the idea for RULA and REBA. And so it quantifies different postures, and I've just pulled out a couple here, so trunk posture and arm posture. And what I like about the OWASP, apart from RUBA and REBA, as we'll see in a second, is that it actually quantifies percent of time in a posture. So it's got fairly, it's got increments of 10%. So it actually gives you a little bit more discrete analysis. And it'll tell you what's acceptable and what's extremely harmful. And essentially what you do is you add up the scores, and then you figure out what risk factor you have in each of those postures. So that's the OWASP system. Some of you will be familiar with RULA. So RULA was designed for the upper limb, so it stands for Rapid Upper Limb Assessment. And this was, it's been around for a while, since 1993. McCartney and Corlick developed RULA, but it did stem from OWASP. And a similar kind of idea. So what you do is, for example, this is a job that I worked out in Kentville, Nova Scotia. Very highly repetitive task, and a RULA would indicate that this would have a very high risk score. Lots of repetition, lots of forces, So you locate the upper arm position, locate the lower arm position, and the wrist score in terms of position as well, whether there's a twist or not, and then you can identify a score. So those are added up, and then you can compare before and after. You can compare between interventions. So widely used, you may easily find one for an occupation that you're looking at or a task that people are doing. This could be used in the workplace. It could also be used outside of the workplace. Very helpful for quantification. REBA, same people, but they did it a little bit later, and now they include the lower legs. So entire body assessment, rapid entire body assessment. But the process is the same. So some of the tools that you can use in a simulation, so if you simulate the job, or if you're on site and you're watching someone doing something, repetition is really a big concern, and so particularly for injury healing, obviously for injury development as well, but you want to have a good quantification of repetition. So we watch a lot of video, so using video and counting repetitions of moving through certain cycles can be very important. You can also measure repetition right off a task description if you have that without actually looking at the video there. But of course there are some confounding effects in terms of duration and acceleration through the joint and so on. But you can get a general idea about repetition. Many jobs, particularly in manufacturing and automotive and forest industries, places where there are healthcare where there are a lot of ergonomists, you may well have access to reports that have looked at real-time assessment. So up in the top left here, this is an electrogoniometer. So here we're actually measuring posture in real time, and then we can quantify repetition, of course, the number of times people have moved through a joint. And then also we can look at absolute postures as well at any point in time. So that becomes really, really useful. This is me maybe 20 years ago. Other systems that we have, so lots of motion analysis systems where we can actually analyze motion, look at biomechanical factors. That can be really useful. So these are some data capture systems that we have. Wearable data capture is becoming much more viable now, and may well be a source that you can use. So, even if someone has a Fitbit that you're looking at, you can send them back into the workplace and look at heart rate very easily, right? I'm not going to go to this link right now, but this is a company that was actually developed in BC and really excited about. They're growing very, very quickly. They have wearable data capture systems that can analyze repetition and posture and other factors, and download that so you can have a really good idea of what someone's done throughout the day, right? So you don't even need to see it anymore. So we take some of that data. This is called captive, and what we can do is we can sync the video up to the electrogoniometer or the force meter, whatever it is, and we can stop it at any time and look at what the posture is. We can look at the variation over time. We can look at combinations of pinches and awkward postures together and say, oh, that's a problem. Let's try to reorganize the task so they're not pinching when they're doing this. Let's get them to do this and then pinch, right? So at a very fine level, we can start to tweak things with our captive system that we have here at SFU. And so it points out, it gives you all kinds of reports and so on of what's actually being done at different points. You'll be familiar with some of the force assessment techniques. So, the Borg scale you probably use in your practice already. Force estimation dynamometers is something that I find in the workplace can be really useful. If you have a dynamometer, get the task simulated, and then get people to simulate the force that they're doing on the task, and then squeeze the dynamometer. And you're going to get a good sense of what that force is required to do that task. And you can see how much grip force is going to change whether you're gripping in a neutral posture or you're gripping in an awkward posture. Right? And that'll be helpful for estimating. We have direct measures, so force transducers and so on. Of course, we have biomechanical models. So these are pinch gauges. That can be useful there in various forms, as I said. We can also use electromyography, which isn't accessible to everybody. I do appreciate that, but that is something that we have at SFU, and we can actually analyze forces through EMG, so we can look at percent of maximum voluntary contractions. We can look at fatigue over time for various tasks, probably more detail than what you would need, but if you have that information, it might be helpful. And then, of course, force transducers, data gloves. These are all very useful techniques for actually looking at exactly the amount of force that's out there. Something I did want to point out as a great resource is something called HandPAK. And Jim Potvin, who is retired now, but was at McMaster University, has done an excellent job in putting HandPAK together, whereby there's norms for pinch, for hand movements, not just pinch, grip, all kinds of grips and so on. And actually takes into account repetition as well, which a lot of our norms don't. So that can be really useful. The only downside is that it doesn't have a cumulative loading effect. So often when we're looking at work, the sort of fatigue over time of tissue is going to exacerbate an injury, not just the absolute time. So that cumulative effect isn't there yet. OKRA. So OKRA is a tool whereby it combines a bunch of different factors together. This was an Italian tool. It's somewhat complicated to actually measure, but you may well be able to find it in some studies. So it's a concise exposure index that quantifies a relationship between the number of actions that are performed and what's considered a safe number of actions. So it's a relative measure, and it'll give you an indication as to whether a task is safe or not. And these are the elements that go into the formula for determining whether the task is safe. So that's the OKRA formula there. Some of you may be familiar with the job strain index. So the job strain index was developed by Moore and Garg, and it's been around for a while as well. It gives you a severity index and similar kinds of variables that go into the equation. And in this case, it's an observational rating scale, but you can also put in absolute values from some of those other techniques that I've talked about, and it's going to give you a job strain index based on all those variables. So that's the job strain index. And this one is the ACGIH hand wrist. There also is one for fatigue, and there's also one for back injuries. But it'll look at, so here we look at normalized peak force, so the peak grip force, versus the amount of activity, repetition. And so here it'll actually give you what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So it's another tool that's out there that may be helpful for you. If you want to look back to your sort of high school physics, the Utah shoulder model is really easy. It really just has a couple of elements in it. It's got the horizontal distance to the load. It has the amount of weight of the load, two angles in it, and you plug those into the formula, and you can look at the load at the shoulder and compare it to maximum capable values. So that can be a really useful normative tool as well. There's a similar one for the back. This comes out of the University of Utah, and it's got some similar elements in it as well. So there are formulas for these things, but there's also, I've given you some links where you can actually plug the numbers in online, and it'll spit out what the load is and whether that's acceptable or not. Lots of biomechanical models. So this is a 3D SSP model from the University of Michigan. And I like this one for KINS, and particularly in a clinical setting, because there's an app now. So this is a very powerful assessment tool that we have here at SFU, but this app is available for free from the App Store, and it's very illustrative. So you can actually, what you can do is you can manipulate the mannequin to simulate the tasks that someone's doing, and then it's going to give you an indication of, in this case, the discompressive force, but it's also going to give you the strength capable at a number of different joints, at the elbow, at the shoulder, and so on. And I use it as an education tool to say, okay, you know, rather than bending over like this, try bringing the load in a little bit closer, see how much difference that makes in terms of how much you'd be able to lift. So it's very illustrative that way, but it also is going to give you an idea of, when you're simulating the task, how much strain are you actually putting on that musculotendinous unit that may be compromised from repetition and so on. There are others out there. Watt back is a familiar one. Jack is another familiar one. There's a number of biomechanical models, but I like, as I say, I like the 3D SSPP because you can actually get that one for free and play around with it. Snook and the MyWall tables, so Snook are very well known. These are tables for limit values for lifting and lowering. So I'd suggest that it's important to be familiar with those, and you can get lots of information about those online. And they look something like this, which I can see, you can see has all kinds of information on it that isn't readable on the slide. But essentially it says width, distance away, and the percentage of people that are capable for different kinds of lifts with different kinds of repetition rates. So essentially what you can do is measure those values and then figure out your limit values there. I've got a few more tools for you. This is the lifting tool that I was telling you about for the lower back. So similar kind of idea. It's threshold limit values for lifting, so that can be helpful for back injuries. NIOSH is another lifting assessment tool. I know our WorkSafe BC has an online tool that you can use to plug in numbers to determine safe lifts and so on. It also has this cumulative loading kind of function. So this is a multiple lifting where you get an increasing decrement in the amount that you can lift because of that cumulative effect. So that's called the cumulative lifting index. Don't be afraid of the formula. Again, you can just plug the numbers in and it'll spit it out for you. It's actually fairly straightforward. So those are a range of different assessment tools that can be used to quantify tasks, to understand tasks a little bit more. To sum up, some of the things that I'd like you to take away from the webinar is really to, first of all, when you have a client, just stop and think for a second. Try to remember that there are concerns when people describe the task, when we have a vision of what we think that task might be. And even when we're going out to search job descriptions or other prescribed ways of doing work, that isn't often the way that it's done, and often doesn't provide us any means to tailor our rehab programs or modify our tasks or our work. Secondly, look around for validated task assessments. So see where you might be able to get hold of something. So once you understand what your client is doing, then you can start to search for some task assessments. And I would suggest within your practice, keep a pool. Keep a source of, physical or virtual physical demands analysis and task analyses as you're gathering them. Videos. Videos are really helpful. So in some of the work that I do, in fact, with industrial design, we do something called a cultural probe, and that is actually sending a video home with an individual. So, if you're trying to assess someone's work, get them to go home and take some video of some of the tasks that they're doing and send it in. You can get a better idea. And then look at some of these assessment tools that I've talked about to try to quantify the tasks. Don't forget about the National Occupational Classifications. Excellent, gives you lots of sort of background information. I didn't show you ONET, or the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, but they're easy to find online and they work in a very similar way. Look for those JDAs that already exist. There's lots of them online. They can be very useful. You're not all going to have access to, academic literature in universities. Some of you might, so I'd encourage you to do that. But also, look at your local library, look at case studies that are online. There's a lot there that can be really useful. Don't forget about simulating the task. Bring in the tools that someone might be doing in their daily living tasks or might be doing in the workplace. A lot of rehab centers are doing this already and having a simulated driving workstation within their rehab process, or a simulated kitchen. Of course, these are all really helpful for understanding the task as well. Use those assessment tools as you can. Develop those task and job specific functional capacity evaluation protocols. And make sure that we're communicating with all stakeholders that are involved in the return to work process and understand what kinesiologist's role can be there. So I'm really excited by what ICBC is doing. I think it really takes advantage of what kinesiologists know and can do. I think that by communicating better between the professions of OT, PT, ergonomics, kinesiology, psychology, case management, we can all begin to understand tasks better so that we can really support people getting back to work and function more quickly. So hope that in the presentation you've been exposed to a few new tools. I will encourage you that if you have any questions, please email them to Darlene, who's helping me out on the side here. So it's Bemister, BEMISTER, @sfu.ca, and she will forward the questions on to me. And as you're writing your questions, I'm just going to do a quick little plug here for SFU and our occupational ergonomics certificate. So we are really committed to ergonomics in our kinesiology program and recognize that work is at least a third, if not half, of what people do. And so we really need to understand how health is important in the workplace as well. So we have an occupational ergonomics certificate. You'll get these slides so you can look at them more carefully. We have a number of courses. We have 4 core courses and then some peripheral required elective courses that you can take. And we have a practicum associated, so we get people out into the workplace. If there's any people wanting students, let us know. We're really keen to engage with the community to find out what you need and also how we can, so that we can serve you better. And I've given you some contact information here. So Darlene, you may know, who's very involved with BCAK, myself, and our BCAK advisor, Sophie. So happy to take any questions that you might have. I think Darlene is going to read them out. If there are any in the room right now, happy to answer them.
Don't have any coming in yet.
Okay, no questions yet. So we'll just give you a few more minutes.
They're delayed. There's a delay.
There's a delay, apparently. Yeah. So happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Time delay.
The one thing, if nobody here, we can announce that there's going to be more seminars in the
Do it.
Yeah. While we're waiting, Daryl's just going to make an announcement.
So I just wanted everybody to know that this is the first of a number of seminars. We're going to try to increase the technical abilities of kinesiologists as we approach the regulation for ICBC in April of 2019. We're going to aim to provide more guidelines on what is going to be looked for as far as postural assessments, functional assessments, what strength testing is going to be, what grading scales they're going to use. That will all come out later on in the new year. So, anyway.
Any BCAK announcements?
No.
Memberships? Logins?
Still waiting for any questions that you might have, so feel free to send them to bemister@sfu.ca. Oh, yeah.
I have a question.
Just speak into the microphone.
So in your practice, do you see a lot of concussion syndromes, and how does that change how you approach job demands?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So the answer really is no. I don't. Concussion is really not within my area of practice at all. So I really can't speak to that. But I've worked with people who are looking at brain injury and return to function, return to work as well. So, the JDA can be really useful. I think that we need better metrics in the cognitive and the behavioral side on the JDA. What I didn't show you actually is that within ergonomics, when we're looking at, sort of human error, and we're looking at multitasking and sort of cognitive aspects, we do have lots of cognitive task analysis tools. And just as I presented some of the physical ones, the cognitive ones could be really helpful in that area as well. So, trying to minimize multitasking, or trying to even out the cognitive load over the day rather than have peaks that might actually trigger, challenge concussions and so on. So I can't speak directly to it, but absolutely I think that there's possibilities there. Yeah.
Okay, and we had one question come in online, and it had to do with ICBC and reporting, and it's regarding the templates. And the question is there going to be specific information requested on those templates? And yes, there is. It'll be vague enough to cover all the types of activities and jobs there, but they will be looking for job demands analysis type of information. So what the tasks are involved, what the current abilities are, what the desired abilities are. Yeah.
And I think what I have showed you today is much more detail than they're going to be looking for in terms of task analyses. But of course, more detail is better than less.
Nothing right now. Nope.
I think that's good. I think we can probably wrap up for now. If anybody has any questions, they can send them directly to the BCAK office.
Yep.
And we can forward them on to you, and we can deal with them as well. So.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.